Chapter 18. McGinnis stared around, eyes wide, and still she couldn't take it all in. Her mind refused to accept what she was seeing. No, 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 no. Her own voice, quiet and disbelieving. Crespi said nothing, his face masked with dull shock. The lab was small, smaller than most of the others on board the station, but still big enough to fit perhaps 100 people. Or 34, her mind tittered. She realized the hysteria was close to the surface, a mad soul-rendering laughter that would turn to screams all too soon. Traditional tables, monitors, computer pads scattered about, and clumped masses of cables leading into and out of tall vertical holding tanks, bubbling with some clear viscous fluid. She turned away from them, not ready to comprehend the aberrant horrors inside, not able to. On the nearest table to their left slumped the headless corpse of what was once a heavy-set man, tubes and cords running from every orifice. The figure was on its knees, the flaccid penis dangling limply above a wired cup that encased the scrotum. Where his head should have been, a misshapen metal plate, set with switches and a series of tiny pulsing white lights. His back and chest were covered with dark hair and hundreds of small lipless scars, some still recent, an angry red. The skin had ruptured at his upper back and twin gleaming bone plates rose a few inches out of where his shoulder blades should have been. The table next to it, another headless body, its belly swollen as if it carried a child, but no human child. The skin had burst in places, unable to accommodate the massive swelling, exposing the glistening red of muscle tissue. More tiny white lights, more switches. In spite of the obvious impregnation, the sex of the figure was unclear. There were no breasts, the entire chest area a mass of scar tissue, no genitalia apparent. A tray between the tables held syringes, scalpels, a handheld laser cutter, and a small blinking monitor and keyboard. McGinnis went closer, unable to stop, drawn to the obscenities as if in a terrible dream. She had to see what the monitors were for. The two once human figures stank of shit and bile as she stepped to the screen, read what was printed there, and moaned a deep, hopeless sound born of sick revulsion and comprehension. The computer listed their pulse rates. They were alive. She backed away, still moaning, suddenly faint. Twisted away from the undead abominations to run, to get away. So cold here. Crespi was there. He reached out, wrapped his arms around her, and held her tight. She struggled, pushed at him, only vaguely aware that the awful, high-pitched mewls of terror and panic she heard were coming from her own throat. He was speaking, but she couldn't hear, saw only the holding tank behind him, the naked, bubbling form inside, the strange, tumorous pink flesh that sprouted from all over it in loathsome tentacles, floating. Crespi again, his pale face thrust into her own. At me! Look at me! She found his gaze then, saw the dark eyes filled with fear, with deep distress, and with acceptance. Lieutenant! Sharon! Deal with it. Understand? Deal with it! She searched his eyes, saw the truth there, and nodded, swallowing. Okay. He let her go, gently, studying her face. She nodded again, took a deep breath. I see it, she said, not even sure what she meant, but he nodded in return. Together they moved through the vault of horrors slowly, stopping between each abhorrent display, too sickened to move any faster to the next. Mutated alien embryos, dissected and labelled. A tangle of human limbs in a refrigeration unit. The strange alien musk, mingling with the scent of human feces and laboratory disinfectant in the damp, cold air. The lab was L-shaped, the two of them still in the front leg. McGinnis wanted out, badly, but knew that they had to see all of it, document the atrocities before they could be destroyed. These people weren't truly alive. The machines were pumping blood and oxygen through their systems in a gross parody of life, forcing them to go on. She imagined that most, if not all, had been dead before they were brought here. Tissue reanimation was nothing new. But what she wanted, more than anything, was to know why. Why had Church done these things? Insanity was too mild a word, but she could think of no other. What are words to this? How can there be a category for this to fit into any language, any thought? 4 more tables, and 3 of the unmoving figures had heads, though limbs were missing, their flesh scratched and scarred, seemingly without motive. The corpses were human, certainly, but their bodies had been twisted and reformed, dark knobs and angles rising from breaks in the skin. "Oh, God," whispered Crespi, and she turned, saw his attention fixed on one of the holding tanks, expression sick and appalled. The submerged figure was male, naked, its light hair floating loosely around its pale, mutilated face. Only the eyes were still whole, wide, the look there, one of shock and disbelief. Lieutenant Mortensen hadn't been jettisoned after all. His exhaustion was probably the only thing that saved Crespi from losing it as they stepped into the lab. That and his fight with the drone back in Church's office. The day was already a surreal nightmare, and the additional horrors of Church's hidden facility somehow fit right in, embraced the atrocity that lay before them. As it was, though, he felt right on edge. McGinnis had helped stave off his own hysteria by losing touch for a moment. Getting her back on track, having someone to watch for, had allowed him to see what was there, no matter how much his mind wanted to reject it. Church was sick, deranged. Crespi searched for scientific reasons, desperate to make sense of the demented experiments. Endorphin release? Telepathine work on reflexes, something like that? Maybe, but it didn't explain the bizarre tumorous growths that rose up from the flesh, the misshapen limbs, the atrocities in the liquid-filled tanks. Oh, God. His voice sounded faint and hoarse in the quiet rife with horrified dismay. Mortensen was suspended in one of the huge vats, his eyes wide and unseeing, unknown tubes and cords leading into and out of his pale, naked form. Slow, mutant bubbles rose around him, inching past his battered flesh and beginning again at his feet. Crespi gagged suddenly, turned away, and then McGinnis was right next to him, her hand cool against his neck. He closed his eyes, then nodded. "Okay, let's finish and get the hell out of here." McGinnis took his hand, and they walked quickly to the end of the lab, turned to the right, started down a smaller room lined with blinking monitors. Nothing but humming computers, machines at work. Crespi felt a faint rush of gratitude. Nothing more, no other horrors here. They could leave, he'd seen plenty. Except... At the very back of the room, a closed door, like the 3 that guarded the lab, round and gleaming, partly open. And next to that, a thing Crespi couldn't quite fit his mind around. It was so strange. He stepped closer, paused, didn't feel McGinnis drop his hand as he studied the newest aberration. The head and uppermost torso of a man coming out of the far wall. Panels of circuitry surrounded him, the top of the head covered with a metal helmet, joined to an eye-level monitor beneath him by way of a long, snake-like metal arm curling downward. That the young man had been dismembered was obvious. Ragged strips of flesh hung down from the place where his chest joined the wall, cauterized and black. That face. Familiar somehow, but he couldn't place it. The stark lips were drawn back, exposing the man's even teeth in a gruesome, eternal grin. His once blonde hair, now dark and dust, flopped down across his smooth brow in lank waves. Even in death, and he must be dead, pulse or no, it was apparent that he was attractive, had once been a handsome man. A low, keening wail just behind him. Crespi twisted around, startled. McGinnis stood there, her face contorted with some horrible pain, eyes bright with it. The sound of her cry long and anguished as she stared at the half-man. What is it?" Crespi touched her, somehow more afraid than he'd been all along at the look of anguish in her wild eyes. She collapsed against him, clutched desperately at his arms and his back with clawing hands, buried her head against him as she screamed 2 words over and over. "It's David! It's David!"